The microwave clock read 4:47 a.m. in a kitchen lit only by the blue halo over the digits. Rodney stood frozen in the hallway, one hand on the doorknob, his palm pressed to the cool brass as if the metal might steady him. He could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint hiss of a distant highway, and then the voice, too bright, too small, laughing in a way that scraped against everything he had been holding together for 3 years. "He's just my personal ATM." The words dropped into the hallway like an icicle. For a second he thought he had misheard. There was a rustle of movement on the other side of the bedroom wall, the soft clack of a shoe against carpet. Vanessa's laugh continued, lighter and sharper, and then, as if she had noticed the silence, she added a phrase that landed like a slap. "He's too honorable. He'll keep paying." Rodney's chest filled with a cold that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn air. He remembered with a clarity that felt both recent and distant, the spreadsheet on his laptop, columns of dates and amounts, a running tally that had become his private litany. He had watched those numbers fall, $127,000 reduced, line by painstaking line, tracking every payment he'd made toward the debt Vanessa had revealed early in their marriage. $73,247 paid. The tiny triumphs, selling his motorcycle, going without new shoes, skipping dinners, all penciled into that file. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he was protecting the promise they made at the altar, together. He could still see the moment she had told him about the debt. It had been in their small rented living room, the TV murmuring a forgotten sitcom in the background. She had folded her hands on her knees and told him the number like it was a confession and a plea all at once. $127,000, she had said, voice cracking. "I don't know how it got this bad." He had watched a woman he loved cry a kind of honest regret he couldn't fix with logic. She'd promised to enroll in counseling, to stop using her cards, to work extra shifts. He'd believed the contrition. He had believed her. He had believed in their vows and in the idea that marriage meant bearing one another's burdens, and so he had stepped forward and did what he thought a good husband did. He shouldered it. The present, however, had a different weight. The hallway's air felt thin. Rodney leaned his forehead against the doorframe and listened harder. The laugh on the other side of the wall continued, a short, delighted sound, not the sound of someone planning to turn their life around. He thought with an awful clarity of the social posts he had scrolled past the week before, a photograph of Vanessa boutique, bags piled at her feet, captions that read, "Treating myself," and, "For once, it's nice to enjoy life." There was no tag for him in the caption.
He flicked through his memory. The receipts she said she'd misplaced, the packages that came with no note, late-night online purchases that she had explained as gifts. Each denial had once fit into a story of slips and recovery. Now those pieces started to look like ledger entries in another person's account, hers. Rodney opened his hand from the doorknob, as if letting go might erase the words. He could do nothing but stand there and allow time to fold inward, the way the seconds stretched when something true and terrible had just been revealed. He thought about what he had told himself at 2 a.m. many nights. It was temporary. It was manageable. Once her balance got under control, we could breathe again. He thought about his 5 jobs, the weekends that no longer belonged to him, the way his collar frayed along the seam because he could not afford new shirts and had no time to shop. He thought about the motorcycle he had sold last spring so they'd have cash for another minimum payment. He thought about the spreadsheet's header, Vanessa, CC debt, payments by Rodney. How had he ever thought naming it wasn't humiliating? He stepped back into the hall and closed the door slowly, careful not to make a sound that would suggest he'd heard anything. He took out his phone, thumb hovering. He could call out, demand an explanation. He could start an argument that would tear through the house. Instead, he turned off the screen and dropped the phone into his pocket. He had shifts to work. He had a warehouse at dawn, a cafe at noon, a rideshare shift at night. The logic he had lived under for 3 years was that labor could cure the unsteady parts of life. Push enough hours and the numbers would balance, the accounts would close, and trust would reseal. Before the sun, Rodney dressed into the muted armor of someone who lived on caffeine and adrenaline, a threadbare jacket, heavy boots with scuffed toes, a heart beating in a rhythm that had nothing to do with peace. He took one last look through the small window of the front door at the dim streetlight that washed the porch in pale orange. He thought of the spreadsheet and felt it under his tongue like a bitter pill he had refused to swallow. At the warehouse, Ray saw him before Rodney saw Ray. "Man, you're early," Ray said, clapping him on the shoulder. There was a familiar, practical warmth to Ray's voice that made Rodney's jaw loosen. Ray had been his supervisor and then his friend, the kind of colleague who showed up with a thermos and a joke and the willingness to cover for someone when they had to be elsewhere. He had watched Rodney move through double shifts, had once asked, quietly, whether Rodney was spreading himself too thin. Rodney had laughed then, the laugh of someone defending a quiet heroism. Today, the laugh stuck in his throat. The pre-shift hum of forklifts and the smell of packing tape provided a ground rod of normalcy.
Rodney rooted himself in the routine. Scan, lift, stack, scan again. His hands moved of their own accord, memorized motions that turned pain into motion. The spreadsheet lived on his phone, a small glowing window he checked between orders, like one checks a pulse. 73,247, it said in the total paid cell, the numbers exact and brutal. He had watched that total climb higher than he ever intended, dollar by dollar, as if savings could be poured down a funnel into someone else's life and still make everything right. On his break, he pulled out his lunch, a simple bowl of instant noodles, brought from home. Vanessa had always loved that he could be content with little. She'd called him humble on nights when money had pushed him to choose rice over steak. He had once enjoyed that characterization. Now it felt like something else, a label used to justify him being taken. Rodney had a memory he kept on a sticky note on his dashboard. We promised to be honest, always. In the marriage, honesty had been a covenant knot. He had tied it and kept it tight. He had not expected, that morning in the hallway, to find the knot pulled loose. After the third shift of a 12-hour day, when his feet ached and his brain felt like gravel, he made time to look through recent bank alerts. Small purchases, dozens of them, spread like a constellation across Vanessa's card. A boutique in the city for $623, another site for $2,190, labeled in his mind as the dress she never told me about, a home decor store for $140, all on a Tuesday night. Some entries matched receipts she had shown him as old or misplaced. Others were surprises. A red flag that had been waving politely now became a wave of searing heat in his gut. There were other things too, delivery notifications that didn't say gift or returned item, just delivered, with confirmation photos showing packages left on her parents' doorstep. He traced the patterns with the careful patience he devoted to building spreadsheets. He printed them out that night from his laptop at the public library, screenshots of orders, transaction histories, photos of packages time-stamped at odd hours. He created a folder on his desktop labeled simply, Receipts, Vanessa. The act of labeling felt like drawing a line. In the early days of the debt, Vanessa had cried and promised. She had told him she would change. She had said things like, "I don't want to be a burden," and "I'll handle it." Those words had meant something once, but words were light and debt was weight. He had watched her attend a support session once, private and solemn, and he had plotted from the doorway, hoping that would be enough. Later, when she swore she was working on herself, he had taken that as a sign that their past would indeed be their past. Men like Rodney are conditioned to trust corrective actions, to wait for behavior to follow apology. He had done so until the hallway at 4:47 a.m. proved that behavior had been a performance.
He told himself during that first week after the overheard call that he might be wrong. Maybe there was context he didn't have. Maybe she'd be ashamed and confess. Maybe the laughter he'd heard had been about someone else. He tried to hold space for all possibilities and found he could barely supply a scrap of hope. The rational part of him gathered evidence like scaffolding. He took photographs of the receipts and transfers. He printed credit card statements and highlighted irregularities with a yellow marker until his fingers were stained. He began to see patterns, regular transfers out of accounts at times he hadn't expected, retail buys matching days she'd said she was homesick, and charges doubling after certain therapy purchases. He logged dates when she claimed to have paid a bill, but the statement showed otherwise. Each note was a small betrayal, folded and tucked into a growing pile. He did not tell Vanessa that he knew. He kept working. He kept making payments. He kept adding to the spreadsheet. He was not the kind of man to make a scene in the early morning, to drag a private life into sunlight with accusations without proof. He had been reared to solve first and speak later. The impulse to fix, to be the one who made a path across the chaos, was part of his muscle memory. There are practicalities about marriage that often go unspoken: whose name is on what, which loan is premarital, and what legal remedies exist if deception is discovered. Rodney did not know the law. He knew he could not afford to lose everything he'd given, and that he needed to protect whatever future he might have. He sought counsel in the quiet way he always had, by collecting information first. He made copies of bank alerts. He printed messages from social media that contradicted what Vanessa said publicly. He wrote a timeline in his notebook, dates of payments, dates of unusual purchases, interactions with vendors. It was obsessive work, maddening in its precision, but it gave him a strange comfort, a sense that the truth could be tallied. On a Tuesday, he sat in a dim coffee shop and opened his laptop to the spreadsheet. He had started a new column labeled Notes, in which he wrote the context of each payment, why he gave, what she'd said, receipts shown. He scrolled through the years like he was flipping through someone else's life. He saw the nights he had come home exhausted and made up another excuse for why he couldn't go out. He read off the totals in a voice so low he barely recognized it. Paid $73,247. The keyboard was warm under his palms. He closed the laptop and sat with the number as if it were a physical thing. His friends and family noticed the change before he named it. Ray said once, "You look like you're holding more than you should." Rodney had smiled. Kathleen, Vanessa's mother, called sometimes, asking about bills and hoping Rodney would be willing to work through things with patience.
Bill, Vanessa's father, would put a hand on Rodney's shoulder in the grocery store aisles, telling him that couples sometimes needed to forgive. These gestures, meant to comfort, began to grind against him like sandpaper. He realized that when the people closest to the problem asked for patience without accountability, what they're often asking for is a quiet return to the status quo. Rodney found himself writing journal entries at night, the only place he could speak plainly. He dated them with small clinical precision. 4:10. Heard Vanessa on phone, 4:47 a.m. Phrase, personal ATM, save evidence. In another, 4:12. Printed receipts, $623 boutique, 3 shipments, on 4/1/43/49. The act of recording was both therapy and strategy. He wrote what he felt, the deep, shuddering anger, the humiliation, but he also wrote what he would need if this moved beyond him. Witness statements, a chain of custody for printed documents, a list of potential witnesses who had seen packages delivered or been copied on messages. His notebook looked a little like a private detective's, careful lines, timestamps, small annotations that made order out of chaos. The first time he brought the folder to Ray's garage, Ray did not make a joke. He sat and leafed through the papers in a way that made Rodney feel like a man handing over a fragile thing. "You gonna do something?" Ray asked. The question landed like a test. Rodney exhaled. He had been thinking about this for weeks. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'm not going to let this be all I am." That decision sharpened into form when he sat across from Jennifer Bradford 6 days later. She was in a modest office downtown. Light streamed between stacked file boxes and a bulletin board cluttered with legal calendars. She was direct, the kind of attorney who wore competence like an old coat. Rodney explained everything in the spare order he reserved for facts, keeping the emotion folded in. Jennifer listened, occasionally flipping a page, occasionally typing a short note into a laptop. She did not offer platitudes. "Every jurisdiction is different," she said when Rodney recited the numbers. "But in this story's jurisdiction, premarital debt is usually treated differently than marital debt. That said, if funds from community accounts, or funds you put toward her debts, can be traced, a reimbursement claim is possible. You'll need to prove you paid and that those payments were not gifts. Documentation matters." Rodney felt relief like a small warm flame. Not because she promised victory, she did not, but because she gave him a language for what he had been doing. Documentation had a legal function. It was not just catharsis, it was evidence. Jennifer asked about receipts, about joint accounts, about texting threads and admissions. Rodney handed her a manila folder that had 2 years of his life inside. Printed statements, highlighted lines, timestamps, photos of packages. She opened it and nodded with a weight that felt like gravity. "This is exactly what we need to start," she said. "We can pursue reimbursement and a dissolution of the marriage if that's what you want. We'll file for an accounting and, if necessary, ask the court to assign certain debts to her name based on misuse. But you should know, every case is unique, and outcomes depend on how the evidence lines up and on local laws. I won't promise what the judge will do. I can promise I'll fight for the legal remedy available here." Her candor steadied him. It was not the tarpaulin of false hope. It was the framework of possibility. Rodney felt his shoulders shift, as if a small part of the weight he'd been carrying had been moved from his chest to the table between them. He left with a list: make certified copies of bank statements, organize receipts chronologically, write a short affidavit about household finances, identify witnesses who could corroborate deliveries and purchases. Jennifer cautioned about being careful with audio recordings. Laws vary, and she did not advise anything unlawful. Her tone was professional and clear. "You did the right thing collecting this," she said. "Restitution isn't guaranteed, but a clear trail gives your case real teeth." Rodney walked the few blocks back to his truck with a manila folder and an odd sense of being both undone and purposeful. He thought of the time he'd invested in 5 jobs, how each gig had been a thread in a safety net he hoped would catch them both. Now those threads felt like a ledger, his labor invested in someone who might not have intended to share the burden honestly.
That night, he didn't sleep more than an hour at a time. In the pauses between dozing, he would return to the 447 memory like turning a page of a book he could not put down. He could still hear Vanessa's laugh, the small cruelty of the phrase, that cold economy of the words. He's just my personal ATM. They ricocheted through him again and again, a terrible loop. He began to set boundaries in little ways that felt monumental. He stopped paying certain discretionary bills that had been funneled into accounts for Vanessa's use. He redirected automatic transfers into a separate account in his name. Routine calls to check in moved from warm inquiries to curt logistics. Vanessa noticed, of course. There were confrontations, sheltered sharp bursts in the kitchen, accusations thrown like knives, each met with his quieter statements. I'm getting legal advice, and I need to protect myself. Her reaction was a complicated performance of hurt and rage. She crafted messages to friends hinting that he was being cruel, that he had made her feel small. He received an email from Kathleen, not accusatory but disappointed. Kids have hard seasons, Kathleen wrote. Maybe Rodney can be more patient. Those messages, aimed at him or overhead, stung.
Rodney understood that part of the fallout of his decision was that some loved ones would prefer calm over accountability. There were practical costs to the choice he was making, too. He moved out of the shared bedroom into a rented room for a few nights to make space for their separation. Each night alone, he wrote in his journal, I have paid $73,247. Current known new debt, $23,400. Potential other liabilities, estimated $15,000 plus. Original disclosed debt, $127,000. Listing the numbers felt like a liturgy of truth. He wanted the ledger to be undeniable. Days became exercises in compartmentalization. Work, collect evidence, sleep, and stolen pieces. He scheduled a few meetings with Jennifer to plan the filing strategy, and each time he walked in, he felt like a man entering an apparatus that would transform private hurt into public record. He watched his life, piece by piece, move from a shared space into a legal orbit. At a gas station on a rainy morning, an elderly woman got into the back of his rideshare car and started talking like most passengers do, about the weather and the city's slow turn toward spring. Her name was Dorothy. She was 82 and had a voice like a soft bell. Halfway through the ride, she asked him, out of the blue, Are you happy, son? He nearly choked on the question. He considered the stock answers people offer. I'm fine, or I'm doing okay. He decided for the first time in months to answer honestly. He told her he was dealing with a hard marriage. She listened, and then, with the kind of clarity that has nothing to do with the opinions of the well, said, There's a difference between being generous and losing yourself. Make sure you get back to who you were. Dorothy's words were simple and dangerous, a reminder that the project of saving someone can become the slow disappearance of the self. Rodney repeated them in the quiet of his truck after she got out, the rain making patterns on the windshield. He had done the math, in more ways than one. Dollars were tangible, but what counted was the life those dollars had been buying. Short-term peace, a continuation of a narrative he had hoped would lead to mutual recovery. He had not realized how many of his evenings and weekends had been spent buying time instead of negotiating honest change. He began to imagine, with a kind of fierce tenderness, what a life with boundaries might look like. 2 nights a week he kept free for himself, therapy appointments that he kept religiously, a motorcycle whose engine he'd miss less than the freedom it represented. The image was fragile but real, and for the first time since the hallway at 4:47 a.m., he could breathe around it. Still, he had duties. The financial record-keeping continued as a ritual.
He created a legal folder system on his desktop and a physical set of 3 manila binders, one for bank statements and transactions he'd made toward Vanessa's debt, one for receipts and unexplained purchases tied to her accounts, and one for communications, messages in which she discussed money, texts that contradicted what she told him, notes that suggested awareness of ongoing spending. He labeled each document with dates and a short description in his neat block letters. The binders sat like loaded instruments on his bedroom floor while he worked. They were both a burden and a protection. And then came the moment, weeks into the quiet investigation, when he found something that changed the shape of the problem. It was a photograph, time-stamped poorly, found in a folder he had not expected to open. At the bottom of an online receipt in a vendor's notes was an address he recognized as a boutique owned by someone his wife had once called a friend. The receipt was large, far larger than anything they'd bought together. The transaction had been approved with funds transferred in a way that suggested more than a borrowed credit limit. It suggested a pattern supported by regular payments. He felt the old desire to fix flare up, to call, to demand, but instead he breathed and added the receipt to the binder labeled suspicious larger purchases. He crossed the street to a public computer and pulled up a map of the boutique's transactions and locations, matching delivery photos to local delivery companies. The evidence added a geography to the problem, not just charges but movement, packages delivered, addresses that corresponded to a life he had not been invited into. His phone buzzed with a text from Vanessa that night. "Why are you being like this? I'm trying." His chest tightened. He could see with a painful clarity the arc that had led him to this absent place. A partner confesses a debt, promises reform, receives help, and then at some point starts to step outside the reform. Rodney recognized the clinical thread of what experts would call a compulsive buying pattern, and yet he could not let that thread untangle her from responsibility. Clinical terms mattered for compassion, not for absolution. He slept that night with binders stacked like a small wall against the door. He dreamt in ledger entries and woke with the taste of ink in his mouth. The decision he had been building towards, whether to file for dissolution and pursue reimbursement, felt less like a snap choice and more like a careful step toward reclaiming what had been lost. He had paid $73,247 of the originally disclosed $127,000. He had evidence of new debt of $23,400 and suspected additional charges around $15,000. These numbers weren't just sums. They were the record of nights he'd been away and opportunities given to someone who had, at least in his mind, exploited that generosity. He had been working 5 jobs to pay off his wife's debts.
That fact, a kind of martyr's headline, was true in its surface detail, but the greater truth, the one that started to make itself known in the quiet mornings when the house was dark, was that the labor had revealed something more profound than indebtedness. It had revealed intentionality. The laugh at 4:47 a.m., the casual way Vanessa had spoken about him being too honorable, the pattern of purchases that suggested an indifference to the sacrifices he had made. He did not want to be a man who made enemies out of ex-lovers. He wanted to be a man who honored his own dignity. That distinction would guide what came next. After another week of collecting, printing, and annotating, Rodney scheduled a follow-up with Jennifer. He wasn't sure what the next steps would look like. He knew only that the evidence was no longer just his private grief. It was something that could be presented, scrutinized, and weighed. He understood enough to know that the law could not render emotional restitution. No judge could hand back the nights he'd missed or the motorcycle sold, but it could, in theory, return money improperly paid, or at least formalize responsibility. On the day he walked into Jennifer's office with 3 bulging binders, his hands trembled a little when he set them on the table. Jennifer flipped through them with a practiced eye, and then looking up, she spoke in a voice tempered by experience. "This is thorough," she said. "We'll need to corroborate some of these things with witness statements and, if necessary, subpoenas. But it's enough to file a petition to start the legal process. You understand that this will make private matters public?" Rodney nodded. The prospect of publicity made him uneasy, but the alternative, a lifetime of quiet erosion, felt worse. He had given much of himself to a marriage that had, by his reckoning, become a place where one partner's needs were consistently prioritized at the expense of the other's stability. There was a moral clarity to seeking remedy, he thought. It wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability and the possibility of rebuilding. When he left the office that afternoon, a drizzle had started. The city smelled of wet asphalt and the faint, sweet decay of overturned umbrellas. He rolled the window down as he drove home and let the rain kiss his face for a few long breaths. At night, he sat at his small kitchen table and made a list of the practical things Jennifer had asked him to do. Affidavit, certified copies, witness contacts. He added one more item in his block letters, as if to remind himself of a value he was trying to protect. Boundaries, greater than, sacrifice. He had been working 5 jobs to pay off his wife's debts. That sentence had once been a quiet badge of honor. Now it read like a diagnosis.
It had revealed a truth he could no longer ignore, that generosity without boundaries could be exploited, and that love without evidence could become the very thing that endangered Pun's future. If this story is striking something inside you, if you see a friend or hear your own name in these scenes, consider subscribing for more stories like this. There are lessons here most people learn the hard way. Maybe we can learn some of them together. The folder was heavy in his hands when he carried it back into the house that night. For the first time since the hallway, he did not stand by the door and listen. He sat at the table, opened one of the binders, and began to pull receipts into chronological order. He wrote the date at the top of a fresh page in his notebook, and under it a short statement: "Prepare to protect what is mine by law and by will." Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, a silence structured itself around the stacks of paper. He had taken the first practical steps towards turning private hurt into actionable record. He had not yet filed the papers, he had not yet served them, but he had moved from being the man who paid to being the man who prepared. There are moments where life forks, and the path forward is not a single trajectory, but a set of decisions stacked one on another. Rodney felt the fork under his feet like a seam. He could try to rebuild trust without consequence and risk repeating the same pattern, or he could name the harm, write it in the ledger, and let the legal system, imperfect and uneven though it was, adjudicate the financial reality of what had been done. He placed the pen down and read the line he had written again: "Prepare to protect what is mine by law and by will." The words were not about winning or punishing, they were about refusing erasure. He folded the notebook closed, turned off the kitchen light, and for the first time in many sleepless nights, let himself sit with a steadier heartbeat. In the next week, he would file the initial consultation notes with Jennifer. He would draft an affidavit. He would call witnesses and ask them to confirm deliveries, dates, and oddities they had noticed. He would sleep in a rented room for a while, which felt like safety rather than abandonment. He would begin the public act of making private pain accountable, not out of spite, but out of necessity. He was exhausted and frightened, and more awake than he had been in years. The binders on his table were a map of what had been given and what might be reclaimed. The truth he'd unearthed by working 5 jobs, the reality of being someone's personal ATM, had revealed its own shape. Now that shape would be subject to discovery, and discovery, in this case, was the first promised step towards restoration. The next morning, the process server arrived, an understated man in a gray jacket with a briefcase, and the patient, practiced gait of someone who made conflict routine.
He left a packet on the porch and slipped away before the house had time to wake into alarm. Rodney learned of it through a text from Jennifer. "Paper served this morning. Wait for a call from opposing counsel." The text felt like both a victory and a detonator. Vanessa found the papers in a way Rodney could not have scripted. The folded envelope lay on the kitchen table beneath a coffee ring he hadn't made, and then her face moved from surprise to outrage so quickly it gave Rodney a small, involuntary vertigo. She clutched the paper to her chest as if it were flimsy armor. "Who sent this?" she demanded, the voice sharp enough to cut the air between them. Rodney did not answer more than he had to. "Jennifer," he said, "I filed for dissolution and reimbursement. I'm trying to do this legally." Her reaction was a performance of hurt. Tears, a gasp that relied on the previous credibility she had earned through earlier confessions, and then the counteroffensive. A string of messages went out that day, merciful, sorrowful notes to friends, an anguished voicemail to Kathleen, who responded with confusion and a plea for patience, and a forward to the neighborhood group chat that painted Rodney as cold and hasty. Derek Paulson, a stout man with a lawyer's punctuality and a private practice manner that read like a tight suit, called Jennifer within an hour. His voice over the phone was smooth and low and clearly intended to unsettle. "You don't have to do this to Vanessa," Derek said, and somewhere inside Rodney a familiar old instinct, politeness as armor, ran a small panicked tremor. Jennifer's reply, clipped and professional, removed the tremor. "This is the client's decision," she said. "He has evidence. We'll proceed." Within days, family ties fractured in small, sharp ways. Bill left voicemails that assumed a return to patience. Friends asked awkward questions that landed like gravel in Rodney's shoes. Kathleen's calls diminished from daily to a single tentative text. Vanessa's messages moved between pleading, recrimination, and a carefully curated spectacle of suffering on social media. She posted photos with captions meant to evoke sympathy. She had always been skilled at performance, at turning private tribulation into public narrative, and this time she was deft at turning the spin. The public ripple of the lawsuit had practical consequences. Vendors who had once honored quick returns balked at questions from subpoenas. Delivery companies required formal requests for records. Jennifer's office grew into a command center. She prepared the initial petition, accompanied by the binders Rodney had handed her, the bank statements, the annotated receipts, the delivery photos, copies of messages.
She also drafted a motion for an accounting and for discovery to unearth the chain of transactions that had paid down balances in Vanessa's name. There were forms and filing fees and careful legal language drafted to translate Rodney's grief into admissible facts. Jennifer explained the strategy plainly. Seek dissolution, demand an accounting of marital funds, present evidence that funds from the marital life had been used to pay Vanessa's individual debts, ask for reimbursement or assignment of debts. She emphasized the uncertainty. Laws vary, judges vary, and the admissibility of certain pieces of evidence could hinge on technical points. "We have strong documentation," she said, "and that counts for quite a bit. But the courtroom is not a ledger, it's a system with standards and human judgment." That candid framing was what Rodney had wanted, a sober view rather than false hope. He handed over more items as they arose, screenshots he had hesitated to save, delivery confirmations he had not noticed, photographs of packages at Kathleen and Bill's porch.
Each piece he produced felt like a small, necessary excision from his life. There were nights he sorted the papers until dawn, threading dates like beads on a string, the pattern of payments, the rhythm of deliveries, the occasional merchant notes that hinted at returns processed under false pretenses. Discovery took time, and it took money. Jennifer negotiated with Derek on dates for initial disclosures. Derek pushed back on everything with the kind of procedural theater that demanded time and patience. He sent a request for a financial affidavit and asked that Rodney produce bank statements going back further than Rodney had prepared. Jennifer responded calmly and methodically. Everyone moved according to a choreography Rodney had never seen. Motions filed, responses drafted, deadlines calendared. He learned the quiet terror of waiting for returns on subpoenas, the small humiliation of every bureaucratic delay. Meanwhile, life continued to insist itself on ordinary terms. He still worked the shifts he had to work at first. He could not, in the early weeks, afford to stop. But he also reclaimed increments of time, a therapy session with Dr. Reeves once a week, evenings he kept for himself, a slow return to small pleasures that did not involve spending on another's behalf. Every hour not accounted toward Vanessa's debts felt like redress, reclamation of the thing the debt had pilfered most, his time. He called Ray and asked him for a favor. Would Ray be willing to write a short statement confirming that he had seen packages left at Kathleen and Bill's porch, and remembering nights Rodney had left for work before dawn? Ray met him in a garage with a thermos and a look that said, "I've got you." He wrote the statement on his lunch break, neat and direct, endorsing the facts Rodney needed.
Dorothy, the woman from the rideshare whose 82 years came with an uncommon bluntness, surprised him with a short email after their next ride. She wrote a paragraph about the kind of man she thought Rodney was, honest, patient, steady, and gave permission for Jennifer to use her words in a character reference if needed. Little gestures like that were not the fulcrum of the case, but in the architecture of evidence, character can sometimes tilt a neutral observer's sense of the parties. Still, the pressure mounted. Vanessa's counters moved beyond social media. She filed a counter-petition asserting that she had been disadvantaged by time away from the marriage due to his long working hours, and hinted that spousal support might be warranted. That document was a legal pebble that landed with a small but consequential splash. It asserted a claim that threatened to complicate the straightforward move toward reimbursement. Derek used it as leverage, narrating to Jennifer his client's emotional and financial hardship, and implying that the dissolution might be more contested than Rodney expected. Jennifer did not flinch. "Counterclaims are common," she said. "They don't preclude our theories. Keep collecting evidence. Document every payment you made, and we'll show the court there's a traceable pattern." The mediation date was set with the deliberate neutrality of someone scheduling an inevitability. The mediation room itself was small and antiseptic, a table in the center, a pitcher of water, chairs that sat at the wrong distance. Sandra Ortiz, the mediator, had a voice that suggested both authority and an ability to listen past performance. She began with the standard line about encouraging both parties to reach a settlement. Mediation is private. It is designed to give you more control than a judge's decision would. The ritual felt oddly intimate for something that could expose intimate betrayals. Jennifer opened the binder on the table and laid out photographs, highlighted statements, and a printed version of Rodney's spreadsheet. The numbers were stark when read aloud in the medium's calm air. $127,000 original disclosed debt, $73,247 paid by Rodney, $23,400 new confirmed debt, suspected additional charges roughly $15,000. Rodney felt his throat tighten when Jennifer pronounced the totals, the manila folders on the table like small altars to what he had given up. Derek rose with a practiced gentleness. He painted Vanessa as vulnerable, someone who had sought help, who regretted missteps, who had tried to reform. He called her actions mistakes and emphasized her recent counseling attendance. He framed the situation as less about malice and more about the messy unfolding of a life in crisis. Derek's job was to humanize his client. Jennifer's job was to parse whether the humanity could coexist with responsibility. Rodney listened as Vanessa spoke, at first with careful contrition, recounting how she had felt overwhelmed and ashamed.
Her voice carried the cadence of someone who had rehearsed sorrow. The room softened in that instant, and a human tendency toward empathy hovered in the air, almost doctrinal in its pull. Jennifer let the moment pass without interruption. Empathy, she had taught Rodney in that office, need not cancel accountability. What broke the performance was a moment of frustration that escaped Vanessa like a cough. Jennifer produced a string of messages that had been sent between Vanessa and a friend, messages Rodney had printed and sworn were real. They were not extraordinary on their face. Laughter, talk of treating myself, and in one line, the very words Rodney had heard at 4:47 a.m. Vanessa read them, and for a second the public mask slipped. "He's just my personal ATM," one line said, and the room tilted.
The phrase echoed in the mediation room with a chill that had nothing to do with air conditioning. Vanessa's face flushed, then paled. She tried to backtrack, tried to say it had been a joke, a hyperbole, yet the rhythm of her voice made the line land like a stone. Sandra, the mediator, watched her, then turned to Rodney with a cautionary look that suggested both the drama of the revelation and the procedural requirement. "We need to be careful about what is an admission and what is performance," she said, "but these are the pieces that help the parties see what's really at stake." Vanessa's defense collapsed in spurts. At one point, when Jennifer highlighted the pattern of purchases and the matching timestamps with deliveries, Vanessa snapped. Her voice rose, strangely fierce. "You think I didn't feel this?" she said. "You think I didn't know what he did for me? He was too honorable. He'd keep paying. I didn't plan to hurt him." The words landed in a way that was not an exculpation. They were a confession and an attempt at justification combined. "He's too honorable" was a phrase that mirrored Rodney's memory of the hallway. To anyone listening, it suggested motive, an insight into why someone might continue a pattern of taking advantage of generosity. It made the case less murky and more human. There had been calculation mixed with self-deception. Derek tried to steer the moment back to remorse. He emphasized counseling attendance and offered a settlement that would assign some of the debt back to Vanessa, while asking Rodney to relinquish some claims in exchange for a reduced public airing. The offer was framed as a way to save both parties from the trauma of a trial. It was a tempting offer in a different world, a world where saving time and money mattered more than proving a point. Rodney looked at his hands. The binders at his side felt like rocks. He had imagined many times what settlement meant, a negotiated compromise that might provide some money back without the ordeal of a trial. Yet he also knew what compromise would feel like. It would mean accepting a partial reckoning while leaving certain questions unanswered.
He thought of the nights he had worked 2 jobs in one day, of the motorcycle he had sold, of the steady erosion, fee by fee, package by package. He took a breath. Jennifer leaned in, briefly, and whispered a counsel that had the weight of strategy and the weight of care. "If you settle, you trade certainty of public judgment for finality now. If you go to trial, you risk more publicity and uncertainty, but you have a chance at a clearer remedy." Rodney looked at the mediator, then at Vanessa. He saw in her eyes something like an exhausted child and something like a calculating adult. He felt the scale of what his choice might mean for both of them. "We'll go to trial," he said, in a voice that surprised even him with its steadiness. It was not a cry for vengeance. It was a demand for accountability and a refusal to be quietly erased. Jennifer nodded and set to work with a quiet, purposeful intensity that made Rodney feel small in the scope of the machinery it took to carry a private life into a public process. The months before trial compressed and stretched. Witness lists were made. Depositions were set. Jennifer prepared Rodney for what it meant to testify, to tell truth in a legal language that demanded clarity and restraint. He practiced the 4:47 a.m. memory until saying it felt like a factual act rather than a private trauma. He kept a careful file of every payment he had made, every transaction that could be traced to funds he had provided. He learned the contour of legal questions, objections, hearsay, foundation, and how to ride them without being consumed by legal minutiae. Vanessa's deposition was a crucible. Under oath, she recounted her struggles and her attendance at therapy. She admitted to purchases she had once denied. Some statements she made were consistent, others contradicted earlier messages. Derek attempted to box her back in with sympathetic narrative. Jennifer used the contradictions to underline a pattern of obfuscation. The deposition produced a string of home-run exhibits, screenshots, merchant notes, and a series of messages that tied purchases to times when Rodney had been away at work. Jennifer also filed targeted subpoenas to vendors who had processed large orders, to delivery companies that had taken the confirmation photos, and to social platforms for message headers. It was a tedious ballet of legal requests and compliance. Some vendors fought subpoenas for privacy and commercial reason. Others complied with the professional indifference of a corporation producing a document. Where there was resistance, Jennifer used it to underscore a willingness to litigate. In the pretrial order, the judge required redacted disclosures to keep private details mitigated. The courtroom would be a public place, but Jennifer was careful. She asked the court for limited sealing of particularly sensitive documents. The judge balanced the competing interests, the public's right to information and the party's right to privacy.
The ruling was cautious and procedural. It set the case on a trajectory and placed limits around what might be displayed. On the morning of the trial, Rodney dressed in a suit that had not seen the light much in recent years. It fit like the old phrase, a second skin, familiar but stiff where time had frayed it. He rode to court with Ray in the passenger seat.
Ray clapped him on the shoulder at the courthouse steps, in the kind of tacit solidarity friends give when words would be awkward. Dorothy waved at him from across the street, a small smile and a soft, "You got this, son," that felt like a blessing. Courtrooms, in their formality, lend a particular cadence to sorrow. The judge, an intermediary with a voice that carried careful impartiality, nodded when Jennifer presented the case. Documentation of payments, itemized totals, receipts linked to deliveries, messages that suggested a pattern. Jennifer called witnesses, Ray, who confirmed deliveries and shifts, Dorothy, who spoke to Rodney's character, and a representative from a delivery company who authenticated timestamps and photos. Each witness added a small brick to the wall of evidence. When Rodney took the stand, he did what he had practiced. He told the story in chronological fact. He recounted the 4:47 a.m. hallway moment with the economy of someone repeating a moment that had already been lived. He read portions of his spreadsheet aloud, numbers that had been his private liturgy made public. He spoke of sacrifices, motorcycles sold, savings liquidated, hours given. He did not embellish. He let the numbers do their work. Jennifer then turned to exhibit the binds that connected payments to purchases. The court displayed photos of delivery confirmation timestamps and merchant notes. The jurors, if this had been a jury case, but in this jurisdiction it was a bench hearing and the judge was the finder of fact, followed with pens poised, not as scavengers but as stewards of a process. Derek asked questions meant to soften the impact. Was Rodney aware these payments were voluntary gifts? Had the parties discussed expectations? He tried to show that donations within a marriage can be complicated by intimacy and that mistakes happen. Vanessa testified as well. Her testimony was raw and more inconsistent under oath than in mediated settings. She spoke about shame, about how therapy had helped, about losing herself in shopping for reasons she could not fully explain. She apologized at times and at others receded into a tone of injuredness. Jennifer questioned her about the direct messages and the precise timestamps. The courtroom at those moments felt less like a theater of antagonism and more like a machine converting private contradiction into public determination. At one point, the transcript revealed the very phrase Rodney had heard in the hallway. A printout of a message read, in the formal, detached tone of the court reporter, the line, "He's just my personal ATM."
The words in print lacked the sharpness of the spoken laugh, but retained their sting. The judge paused, as if calibrating the moral weight of a phrase that, in other hands, could be dismissed as banter. Instead, it sat on the page like a small, cold object that needed weighing. After closing arguments, Jennifer calm, focused on the traceable ledger of expenditures, Derek eloquent, emphasizing human frailty and the need for compassion. The judge retired to consider. The waiting was surgical in its slowness. Rodney sat and tried to feel each muscle in his face not tighten, not collapse into either triumph or despair. When the judge returned, his voice was measured. He explained the legal calculus. In this story's jurisdiction, premarital debt is ordinarily separate, but marital funds used to pay that debt may, in certain circumstances, support a reimbursement claim. He emphasized evidentiary thresholds and the court's duty to weigh the probative value of documents. He noted the credibility assessments necessary when one party admits to treatment and another provides tangible, dated transactions. Then he rendered judgment: dissolution of the marriage, assignment of the majority of the marital debts to Vanessa, reimbursement to Rodney in an amount approximating $58,000, and an order that the court would retain jurisdiction to enforce payment. The award was not a precise mapping of every dollar Rodney had paid, but it recognized a reimbursement right based on the evidence in the judge's discretion. The ruling also set terms for a payment plan and signaled that the court could implement remedies in cases of noncompliance. Jennifer read the ruling quietly, without triumph. Rodney felt a hollow, full sort of relief that a formal mechanism had acknowledged what his ledger had said for so long. Jennifer, always careful with language, reminded him in the hallway of the courthouse of the necessary caveat. "This outcome is specific to this case and this court," she said. "Every jurisdiction handles these matters differently. What happened here is not a guarantee for everyone in every state. If you or anyone watching needs guidance, consult counsel in your area." Rodney nodded. The words were practical, tethering his personal triumph to the larger truth of legal contingency. He had wanted the right outcome for himself, one that returned some of what had been given and assigned responsibility. He had not wanted a spectacle. The court's decision had not given him his lost nights. It had given him a formal recognition and a mechanism to pursue restitution. The days after the judgment were practical and odd. Vanessa's obligation to pay, as decreed, was a legal fact, but legal facts require practical enforcement. She was ordered to make regular payments. The court's retention of jurisdiction meant that non-payment could prompt wage garnishment, liens, or other enforcement actions.
Derek, while clearly disappointed, negotiated a payment timeline with Jennifer that he argued would maintain a modicum of dignity for his client. There was no fanfare in the back and forth, only the same procedural grind that had defined months of preparation. The law had given Rodney a tool. How effectively it would be executed would depend on Vanessa's compliance and, if necessary, the court's muscle. There were small acts of reparation. A direct deposit appeared after a month, a modest sum toward the ordered reimbursement. A payment plan was set up, automated, and Rodney watched the first entries come through like small, cautious footsteps. He did not dance, he did not shout. The money did not fix the nights he had missed. It did, however, allow him to stop adding more hours to his week. He cut down the shifts that had been an abrasion on his life. He rented a small apartment that felt to him like a first proper step toward a life not choreographed around paying another's debt. He reclaimed his motorcycle at the end of the year, not the exact model he'd sold, but a bike that fit and that he could ride without the weight of debt dragging at his pockets. The purchase was not ostentatious. It was a symbol he allowed himself, a controlled indulgence that marked the return of some freedom. Therapy with Dr. Reeves became less an emergency and more an architecture for future life. They talked bluntly and kindly about shame and complicity. Dr. Reeves named the dynamic without moral theatrics. Generosity can become a form of codependence if it lacks boundaries and mutual accountability. Generosity is beautiful, Dr. Reeves said in one session, but generosity without boundaries is like pouring water into a cracked vessel. It never replenishes. Rodney worked to reconfigure his internal stories. He had equated being a good husband with bearing another's financial burden. Therapy reframed that as a misplaced equation, one that had led to a slow diminishment of his personhood. He learned to say no, practicing it first in role-play exercises and then in small real-world choices, declining a last-minute extra shift, turning down a friend's appeal to lend money, keeping 2 evenings a week reserved for reflection and rest. Months became a sequence of small recoveries. In month 1, he slept more than 3 hours straight for the first time in a long time. He organized his finances into a plan that included a small emergency fund, an anti-debt, if you will, that he built with the careful patience that had once been misapplied. In month 2, he reconnected with Ray on days off. Simple things like a barbecue in Ray's backyard, where the conversation was about the baseball game and not accounting spreadsheets. In month 3, he met Kathleen at a coffee shop.
They both cried a little, and also made a strange mutual pact of moving forward with boundaries. Kathleen promised to stop forwarding every message to him and to read the situation with less default forgiveness. By month 4, he found himself at a group meeting Dr. Reeves had suggested, an accountability group that framed compulsive spending in clinical terms but emphasized restitution and responsibility. He listened to women and men speak of repair and anger and genuine change. Vanessa's presence did not feature in those rooms. Her recovery, if any, was a separate story. Rodney learned to hold both truths. Someone could be struggling with a clinical problem while still being accountable for the harm they had caused. Month 5 brought a small, unexpected human moment. At a grocery store by the new apartment, he ran into Dorothy again. She was steady, smiling, commenting without pity. "You look lighter," she said. It was more than a compliment. It was a report on the arc of healing he'd begun to live. Rodney, who had shared so many small confessions with her in the back of his rideshare, accepted the observation without wrapping it in guilt. By month 6, the payments had begun to trickle with greater regularity. The ledger he kept, no longer the obsessional nightly liturgy, but a sober accounting, showed that the court's mandate had effect. Jennifer had stayed on as counsel to ensure compliance and to file motions when payments lacked. It was not a clean closure. Legal enforcement rarely is. There were missed payments, and then remedial filings, and then, eventually, steady receipts. The monetary restitution did not erase the erosion of years, but it allowed Rodney to stop working multiple night shifts and to reallocate hours toward himself. There were moments of social awkwardness to navigate. Mutual friends adjusted their visits and judgments in small, fidgeting ways. Kathleen called less often at first, then more carefully, offering practical support rather than open advice. Bill came to see Rodney once, and they sat at the kitchen table with cups of tea and spoke of work and the weather and, awkwardly, gardening. Healing is not a tidy arc. It is a messy tapestry of small human repairs. Rodney continued to write in his journal, though his entries changed tone. They moved from furious recitations of the ledger to more reflective notes. 7/12. Bought groceries with cash. Felt small joy. Kept Tuesday evening for myself. He wrote letters he never sent, and cards he wrote and ripped up. He practiced being alive not as service to someone else's debt, but as a person whose time, money, and attention had intrinsic worth. He also learned to set boundaries that were practical and enforceable. He told Kathleen and Bill he would respond to family updates in a way that honored information without making him liable for continuous bailouts.
He blocked a credit card auto-pay that had once been set to move funds to an account with Vanessa's signatory, an administrative but symbolic act. He did not gloat. He simply performed tasks that re-established the autonomy that had been taken. One evening, months after the trial, Rodney sat on his motorcycle at sunset, the engine purring calmly, the city stretching like a map at his feet. He wrote in his journal, not as a litany of injuries, but as a consolidation. "Vengeance is not the point," he wrote. "Restoration is. The ledger matters because it tells the truth, not because it makes someone ashamed. I'm shifting from paying to protecting, from saving to stepping back." The emotional contours of healing continue to show up in ordinary ways. He let himself be seen as more than a ledger. He allowed a friend to invite him to a hike and accepted without calculating the cost. He let small pleasures, music on a Friday night, the smell of coffee on a slow morning, be what they were, not compensatory, but simply alive. There were still practical follow-ups, motions for enforcement when payments lapsed, calls from Derek negotiating modest adjustments, subpoena responses. Jennifer, precise and steady, continued to shepherd the legal threads until the court closed its file with a final notation that left both parties free to pursue their lives within the legal contours the judge had set. Jennifer reminded Rodney in their last official meeting that law is not moral cleansing, it is a tool. You use the legal tools to reassign financial responsibility, she said. Use therapy and boundaries to do the rest. The story's smaller human textures did not vanish. Vanessa reached out at one point with a tentative apology. It was brief and careful, and to Rodney sounded like someone practicing a new speech in front of a mirror. He replied with what he had learned, a clear boundary and a wish for genuine help. He suggested professional treatment and offered no promises of resumed intimacy. She responded, and then a silence settled between them that was neither bitter nor warmly reconciled, just a new, less entangled distance. In time, Rodney dated again, slowly, awkwardly, with guarded hope. He dated in ways that demonstrated the difference he had learned between being generous and being consumed. He sought partners who understood boundaries and who had their own financial literacy. The smallness of that discernment felt like a new maturity rather than mere caution. He also made time to share what he'd learned publicly, not because he wanted to instruct, but because there was a practical charity in translating bitter lessons into helpful tools for others.
He worked with a counselor group to refine a list of takeaways, keep meticulous records when debts are shared, understand what is premarital and what is marital in your jurisdiction, seek legal advice early if you suspect misuse of funds, set boundaries, and seek therapy both for the person who overspends and for the person who enables that overspending. For viewers who might wonder what actionable steps made the difference in Rodney's case, Jennifer's short, plain language explanations had been crucial in the early days. She had once explained, outside of court and with no rhetorical flourish, that a reimbursement claim often requires proof of payment, plus proof that the party receiving the payments was unjustly enriched by them. If you can show you paid the debt and that the other party benefited from those payments, you have a basis, she said. But you need that documentary trail, bank records, receipts, proof of delivery, because memory alone isn't enough in court. She added the necessary caveat, and remember, this is case-specific and jurisdiction-specific. Speak to a lawyer in your area to understand how these principles apply near you. Rodney's story also carried a moral the therapist helped him shape into a principle. Boundaries are a form of protection, not cruelty. In sessions with Dr. Reeves, he worked through the shame that often follows being exploited in a relationship. Shame tells a particular story, that you should have known, that you should have stopped it earlier, Dr. Reeves said. But shame rarely helps you build boundaries. Strategy does. Rodney learned to practice strategy, small, repeatable behaviors that preserved his autonomy. One unexpected part of recovery was the community that hovered around him in those months. Friends who showed up with food when legal filings piled up. Ray, who offered to take a night shift so Rodney could go to a therapy group. Dorothy, who continued to offer mundane but life-affirming wisdom. Those gestures were small and practical supports that did not pretend to resolve everything, but helped him refill spaces drained by years of overwork. At a community meeting months later, Rodney found himself speaking about one practical habit. Label things, he said. Label your payments, keep screenshots, write dates on receipts. If you feel embarrassed, remember that embarrassment is not a reason to be wronged. The crowd laughed at the candidness of the line, the unfortunate truth that privacy often protects wrongdoing. He stressed compassion for the struggling partner while insisting on accountability. Treatment matters, but treatment doesn't absolve. Healing, he learned, was not a straight line, but a corrugated path of small improvements, setbacks, and steady practice. There were days he felt outraged again, a memory, an old sting, but those moments were punctuated by more frequent ones of ordinary peace.
He found his life had room again for books he wanted to read and music he wanted to play, and for friends whose company had been stretched thin by his previous schedule. On the first anniversary of the filing, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote a final reflection to close the book he had begun the night he labeled the first binder. He did not write for an audience. He wrote to mark what he had learned. The habit of documentation, the discipline of boundaries, the refusal to be the unlimited resource for someone else's crisis. He wrote that generosity must be voluntary and mutual. It must not be a tool for exploitation. He wrote gratitude for people who had helped him and for the therapist who had given him language to understand the harm. In the final pages of his journal, he wrote simply, "I worked 5 jobs to pay off my wife's debts." The effort revealed a shocking truth, that love without boundaries can be exploitation in plain clothes. The law won't fix everything, but it can stop the bleeding. And the greatest recovery is learning to value yourself enough to ask for fairness, without turning fairness into revenge. He kept the binders for a while, locked in a closet not out of spite, but as a record that he could, if necessary, present again. He filed copies electronically and kept the original receipt lists in a safe place. The binders had been tools. They had done their work. The ledger no longer defined his identity. It documented a wrong that had been set toward remedy. Years later, when he retold the story to a group of neighbors over coffee, his voice was even and calm. He spoke of the early days, of the particular hum of the microwave at 4:47 a.m., of the calculated cruelty and laughter, and of the tedious, necessary craft of building a case. He closed the circle with the practical and the tender. How therapy had opened the space to heal, how supportive friends had stayed, and how legal redress had helped him reclaim time and resources. He emphasized responsibility over revenge. "What would you do?" he often asked at the end of retellings, not to solicit sympathy, but to spark thought. Would you keep paying? Would you document? Would you set a boundary? Every situation is different, but whatever you choose, make sure it's a conscious choice. If this story touched something for you, if you see an element in a friend's life or your own, leave a comment below sharing what you would do. And if you want more true life stories about injustice, recovery, and practical steps people took to walk forward, subscribe to the channel.